Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 Brooklyn Book Festival. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nicole Rudick, and I'm the moderator for the conversation tonight with cartoonist Leslie Stein and Adrian Tomine. We're here to discuss their new books, Leslie's I Know You Writer and Adrian's The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Cartoonist, both published by Drawn and Quarterly. After this conversation, you can head to the link below and purchase the books at Drawn Festival booth. I Know You Writer is a memoir that deals with abortion, questions of reproductive health, and personal choice. It's Leslie's third memoir after Bright-Eyed at Midnight and Present, which won an LA Times Book Prize. Her diary comics have been featured in The New Yorker and Vice and in Best American Comics. Oops, if I can get this. Loneliness of the Long-Distance Cartoonist is also a memoir about a life in art, specifically the often mortifying trials and tribulations of being a cartoonist. Adrian's graphic novel, Shortcomings, was a New York Times notable book, and his short story collection, Killing and Dying, was a New York Times graphic bestseller. He's been a regular contributor to The New Yorker since 1999. So welcome to you both.
Hi, everybody.
And to start, I'm curious why you both decided to tell why these stories and why now. Adrian, would you like to start?
Sure. I think I'd say for the last 2 or 3 books that I've put out, every book has been sort of in response to the one prior to some degree, like within the range of my capabilities. And so whenever I finish a book, I always feel like the last thing I want to do is another book that's exactly like the one I just finished. And especially after finishing my previous book, Killing and Dying, I really wanted to do something different because that ended up taking about 7 years to complete. And it was just it was slow to produce, but it was also difficult to produce too. The subject matter and it came at a time in my life that there were a lot of distractions with both my daughters being born and my wife was getting her PhD at the time, and so just finishing that book just felt like I wanted to put it behind me in a way, and so I just tried to think of an idea for a book that would give me a different working process in almost every way in terms of subject matter and drawing style and tone and everything. And I'd sort of had a vague idea about doing a book like this for a long time and had felt some apprehension about it, but the timing seemed to be right. And so that was a good nudge for me to finally tackle it.
Why the apprehension?
Well, Leslie might know what I'm talking about a little bit, but it's, maybe not actually. I don't know, Leslie. For me, it's I'd gotten very comfortable with expressing myself through fiction, and even though I started out doing a lot more autobiographical work, I found over the years that I was able to be, in a way, more open and more revealing and more introspective through fictional stories, and I felt like I'd really gone as deep as I'd gone yet with Killing and Dying, and so I didn't want to do an autobiographical book that was suddenly very impersonal. I mean, that's one of the risks of doing autobiography. And I think there's plenty of comics that are like that, where the author or the artist is visibly the main character, but it's very not introspective. It's not revealing, and it's not very thoughtful in some ways. So I was nervous about what that would mean. I was able to get to that zone when I was drawing made up characters saying made up things, but the idea of trying to get into that same area mentally and creatively and being very forthright about this is actually me saying these things was a little nerve-wracking.
Yeah, it's interesting because a couple of weeks ago I did a Zoom with a class in Florida, and one of the women in the class was working on an autobiographical book, and her question for me was, what do you do when you're feeling like is this story worth telling? Or is this boring? Or is there 100 versions of this already? Like, how do you keep going? And I said, the fact that you're thinking that way means it'll probably be good, because if you weren't thinking that way, if you're like, I'm the first person that ever fell in love, and like, this is so, it's good to think about like it being universal and that there's a story that you can kind of add to, as opposed to like, this is the ultimate version of this or something like that, which I guess is what I was trying to do with this book, because what I was trying to do is take universal subject matter of like having children or not having children and like developing your own personal philosophy, and then just kind of my take on it. And especially because I'd been working with autobiography beforehand, it was a pretty easy transition to doing like a long format book that goes more into depth into issues, as opposed to like short stories, which I was doing before.
Are these the most personal stories you think you've written? And is it difficult to sort of expose yourself in that way? Leslie, do you want to start?
I don't think it's the most personal story I've ever written, because I think most of my stories have always been personal. I just think it goes back to getting more in depth into topic, because before I was working in short stories, and this is one story that's 140 pages. So of course it's going to get deeper. And because like the topic deals with like bodies and stuff, people think of that as being personal, but like your mind is connected to your body. And like, to me, if I have an idea or thought in regards to anything, like it's very personal.
Yeah, I feel like I was saying, that some of the fictional work that I did prior to this book, especially in hindsight, is extremely personal, if not autobiographical. But this book was, I guess, the most direct is what I'd say, is that it's there's no veil of fiction or sarcasm or anything like that for me to hide behind. I mean, it's supposed to be a funny book, but by the end, there's some very kind of earnest elements to the story that come out that in a way were nerve-wracking for me, not so much because of like earlier in the book, there's stuff with me having like digestive problems and being humiliated at bookstores and all that stuff, which was actually very easy for me to write and put on paper and know that it was going to be published. But the stuff towards the end that gets a little more serious was more challenging for me, because I've spent so much of my career sort of kind of playing hide and seek with the audience a little bit, and kind of making things seem like they're autobiography, but then retreating and saying they're fiction, and all these variations on that. And this was just like me very nakedly saying, like, like there's a part where I write a letter to my kids, which is something that like the 20-year-old version of me would have like, couldn't believe that I would be doing it someday. So it was just a really different kind of challenge.
I wondered if you felt like, in both cases, that these were stories that couldn't have been told earlier in life. Yeah. I mean, Adrian saying, that having children for you was sort of, I remember at the end when you're writing a letter and then you crumple it up and say, this is sentimental, stuff. I can't have this. Like, yeah. Clearly, like Leslie, like these events happen to you now, but do you feel like you couldn't have told these stories earlier in your life?
Should I go first?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so being in your 30s, I was 35 at the time I started writing it, is the time when people are kind of on the path of having children and a family, or whatever path they choose. And so I felt like every conversation I was having in my life was kind of, there was always talk of that decision or not. So, and I think it was a lot different in my 20s. So I think having the experience of having the abortion really opened me up to thinking about all the decisions I had made prior and that I would make in the future, and compare those to other paths, all of which are wonderful and valid. So the tone of my book is very just conversational. There's not a lot of, it's just me talking to different people about their approaches to it. Like a friend of mine who had like a vasectomy at age 30 because he's just like absolutely doesn't want to have kids, or a friend who had twins recently who's very upset with the environmental impact of having children and is trying to negotiate that. And then what I wanted to do is my story kind of encapsulate all the other stories. So like it was a vehicle to have these conversations that I had been having with people for a long time at that point. So yeah, definitely, I think me being 35 at the time was the right time for me to approach that subject.
Yeah, Leslie, I thought your book was interesting in that it like you're talking about right now had almost like a journalistic quality where you're almost like a reporter presenting a broader story on a certain subject, but with sort of the through line being your own personal experience. And I think it could have easily been presented, if it was written out, it could have been presented like a news article or something like that. But it was just a really original approach, I thought.
Oh,
Sure. And I mean, I think I sort of said this in the previous answer, but this is definitely, for me, this was a book about this stage in my life for sure. And so aside from the actual content of it, I think the tone and the I don't know, the aim of it are things that probably would not have been very appealing to me when I was younger.
Your compliment of Leslie's book struck me because, Leslie, there was one reviewer who criticized you for not sort of examining the societal forces that, for instance, result in a disparity of reproductive health options and levels of care for men and for women. But I was so struck by something that you write in the closing pages about trying to meditate on your feelings. And as you write, trying to ignore the noise that sometimes surrounded me. And those lines in the book are accompanied by this voice on the radio saying something about an anti-abortion rally, and you sort of turn the radio off. And so considering those larger forces, like the large conversation around reproductive health and abortion seemed to me outside the intent of your book. Like it was very, I think at heart, a personal reckoning with leading the kind of life that one chooses to lead.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, in the way that you talk about telling your students that your story is adding on to somebody else's, that this wasn't a book necessarily about abortion. It was about sort of you, finding out how you felt about things, how you felt about different aspects of living.
Right. And one thing that made me, because I was apprehensive about writing this book as well, because I didn't know if I wanted to inhabit that mindset for like a year and a half. So, but right afterwards was when Brett Kavanaugh got his, all the hearings we're having with that. And I was just looking in the future and what we're dealing with right now. And I'm going, man, like Roe v. Wade's going to be overturned or something like that. Hopefully not. But that's bringing up a lot of issues for women who have had abortions or that will in the future on an emotional level. Like when that sequence about the radio where she's turning, I think I was criticized because the reader read it as apathy. But really what it was saying like, this man or the government should not have a part in this story, but at the same time acknowledging that they do. So it's like having half of his name is there's an acknowledgement of the fact that that's reality, but also that, in my opinion, that it shouldn't be that way.
Mm-hmm. For both of you, is it, I guess, how do you balance the sort of political and the personal as you work through these stories? Because in Adrian, in your book, there are elements, and again, the book isn't about this, but there are elements of bigotry that you experience and racism. So how do you kind of decide where that balance will be? Adrian, do you want to start?
Sure. I think for me, it wasn't a deeply considered choice. I was sort of writing and drawing this book in a way that I never had before, which is sort of in order just drawing each page one at a time without a lot of pre-planning or advanced writing or anything like that. So it's a lot more intuitive than I worked in the past. And I think, if I'd worked in a different way, I might have been more considered in that regard. It wasn't an aim. I wasn't like going down a checklist of big topics that I was trying to address with the book or anything like that. I was just going through memories, and there's a certain thread in that regard with some of the memories. But I was, to me, it was interesting when the book came out that a lot of the response from I would say largely white reviewers or critics was that, oh, this is a story about racism, and what a troubled industry this is. There's all this racism within the industry. And that sort of was interesting to me, because to me it felt like that was coming from a place of not just always having that kind of fluttering around in the background, which for me was kind of a common occurrence, not like getting beat up by guys with baseball bats or something like that, but being in a room full of white people and thinking nothing of it, and then suddenly someone will make one little comment, and then you feel like, oh, wait a minute, now I remember why I'm different, or something like that. And also just I felt like all those anecdotes were actually, rather than trying to make a point about the comics industry, I think they were just sort of more about my life in general. And that the truth is, the things that I experienced within the comics industry are actually quite mild and benign compared to things that have happened in real life. And so I don't want people to read the book walking away thinking like, it's a horrible industry and minorities are constantly mistreated or anything like that. Because I think in general, just compared to being a kid in public school or something like that, it was a very pretty thoughtful and I don't know, open and welcoming industry for me.
I think reading it, that those aspects of it felt just very real. Like, This is what's happened sometimes. And I mean, it took me a long time to read your book, Adrian, because every chapter I'd have to put it down and be like, SPX 2004 in Bethesda, Maryland. And I have a story that's like, if you're at a cocktail party, like every single story you tell, like I have a version of that.
Yes.
And something we talked about really briefly when I saw you was you were saying, I hope you don't mind me saying it in this, but that this book in a way is for other cartoonists in a way. And that helps me a lot when I'm writing something, is I'm thinking about maybe a specific person that would appreciate the story to help you keep going.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
Yeah, well, I in the past, I've sort of really tried to block out any thoughts of who the audience for the book would be. And I just sort of let whatever comes out of me just flow onto the paper. But with this, I had to sort of make some conscious choices about like, do I have to have some whole explanatory thing about like, there's this thing called Comic-Con and what happens there is blah, blah, is it for someone who has no idea what that's about? Or is it for someone who's gone there for 13 years in a row like I did and wanted to hang themselves in their hotel room every night, And so I eventually just kind of took the second path and felt like, that there might be some part of a readership that doesn't understand every bit of it, but there will be some part of the readership that will absolutely get every joke and every detail about it. And that's really who I was thinking of when I was making this book. And so for me, it was nice to get like just a general review from someone who comments on the book overall. But what really meant a lot was to hear from people like you or any other cartoonist friend of mine who says, I had a similar experience or I was there that night and you're wrong and what actually happened was this or that or something like that. So those were the reactions that really, really resonated with me this time.
Yeah.
Leslie, do you write with an audience in mind?
With this book, I didn't as much. But when I was doing short stories, I was doing 5 pages a week for a long time, for like 3 years. That's what Present is. It's just like a collection of the best of those stories. But sometimes if I didn't have an idea that week, I would try to think about a conversation I had with a friend and going like, maybe I can make a comic. If I know one person that feels this way, then there's plenty of people that feel this way. Mm-hmm. So I would kind of do that, and then that would actually work because I was writing stuff for online. So yeah, people would write me, oh, I remember doing this one where I wrote about, I just thought, oh man, people don't think I'm such an idiot, but that every night at dusk, like dusk is my favorite time of day, but right after the sun sets, I get this immediate kind of like depression, and I don't know what it's about, and it's like this fear. I never talked to anyone about it, so I just drew a comic about it, and like I got a bunch of calls from people, like friends of mine that I had no idea. Like, I feel that way too. So that's kind of an interesting. There's developments, good and bad, as Adrian knows, that comes from exploring topics that I'm not sure what the response will be.
Right.
Adrian, I remember you saying something when Shortcomings came out about how you were surprised that, you felt like you were the only person who had sort of had these feelings or experienced this thing. And then it turns out there were all these people who were like, that is me too. And even though you say that the new book is in some way a book for a cartoonist, I mean, multiple times I could relate to the horrible, the general horrible feelings.
Yeah.
It's funny the way that, by any measure, you're a successful cartoonist, but the sort of indignities are the ones that stick with you, and I feel the same way. And why is that? Yeah,
no, I mean, I think both Leslie and I kind of make a good case for zeroing in on the specifics and the personal and telling it directly from your heart, and then a readership finds it and connects with it, as opposed to trying to craft something in terms of how will this click with the most number of people, and how can I make this as broad as possible, and what will lead me to the most sales or something like that. And I think that that's always kind of like a misguided path in most art forms, whether it's comics or filmmaking or anything like that. But
You've never had I'll just throw a vampire in here and get some.
I certainly have. I mean, it's kind of depending on finances, where I'm at in my life. But even that I think even that I'd make a distinction between like working within genres and crassly trying to cater to as broad an audience as possible. Like, I think we both know plenty of people within the comics business who have worked within certain genres, and their work is just as personal and intimate as anything that we're doing. So, but Nicole, I was gonna just say that when Shortcomings came out, that I'm glad you reminded me of that, because not to get too meta here, but actually when I think back on it, I'd forgotten all about that, and I forgot saying that to you, but I remember all the people who were so angry with me for the book and who came to events on that book tour to kind of put me on the spot and ask me slightly confrontational questions and the negative response that it got. So it's funny that as I depict in this current book, my mind has sort of eradicated the positive and completely enshrined the negative.
What were you attacked for?
Oh, it was, it's changed. The reaction to that book has definitely changed over the years. But when it came out, I guess I don't want to analyze the audience too much, but in hindsight, my impression was that even just 12 years ago, there was less of an Asian American presence in pop culture in terms of representation in comics or movies or whatever. And so I think there was this feeling of like every little depiction really counts. And so if this guy has worked his way into a position to publish a book, don't make him such an asshole. Like don't make it this character, And so it was largely a response from, and it was difficult for me because it was a lot of an audience that I was really proud to have cultivated leading up to it, which was sort of a young Asian American audience who I would look out at book events and feel like, God, these were friends that would have really made a big impact on my life had I grown up around them. And I didn't know these people when I was growing up. And so then to see some of those people be offended or annoyed with a book that I, in my mind, made kind of for them was tough to swallow at the time.
It's certainly more an indictment of the publishing industry than, of course, you.
Yeah, possibly. But that's a good example of what I was saying earlier of writing something just kind of thinly veiled autobiography and sort of playing with the audience's perceptions a little bit, and then going out and facing the public and getting such a negative reaction that, like, over the course of that book tour, it turned into like, oh, this is a fictional story and it's a critique of a person that I dislike and it's a cautionary tale. And I sort of rewrote the script on that a little bit as I was promoting it.
Good memoirs, I think, are really about the sort of thin membrane between the inner world and the outer one. And I wonder whether comics, which not only combine, words and pictures, but are able to sort of toggle so easily between speech and interior thought, are particularly good for memoirs. Do you think so, Leslie?
About the form being good for memoir?
Yeah, whether it seems,
Form.
Yeah, let me see if I think I pulled a couple pages here. Let me see if I can find them.
Obviously I think so, since that's how I work.
So here, for instance.
Oh, yeah, okay. I see
page from your book, Leslie. Just sort of all the different things that are going on a single page. You get that interior world in the way that the interior world then sort of comes out into the outer world. It's just so seamless. I don't know whether, certainly fiction can do all kinds of things, prose, but I just wondered if you felt that comics were particularly, good for this sort of.
I think they are, but it's like anything. Some people are better dealing with subject matter as a comic. I think I'm just a cartoonist, so anything I do is going to be a comic. So I'm trying to figure, like right now I'm working on just like a very straight comedy, kind of going back to what Adrian was saying at the beginning of like, now I want to just do something totally different from the last book. So it's just like about a band that's on tour and it's a comedy and it's just like kind of almost like a hate-esque comic. And that's very freeing at the moment. But it looks similar to this. And I do have people having internal dialogue while there's external things happening, which I guess is what you're showing here, especially in that first panel. And that's, for me, that's how I live life, like there's something happening, but I always have an internal dialogue going on. So like that seemed like a good way to express it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I feel like there is something special, especially about comics in print form, where like this new book of mine, I designed it to look like a sketchbook, and I feel like, Leslie, your books kind of give me that same feeling of, maybe it's because I've seen some of your process and I've seen your originals, but it doesn't feel like I'm looking at something that has been run through a computer and it has the feeling of looking through actual artwork that you made by hand. And that was what I was trying to get across with this book too. And I do think that there is something kind of special about, one person sitting in a room and holding a book and looking at, markings on a page that one other person had made on their own, even more so than a prose book with typesetting or something like that. It does feel, it has an intimacy, almost as if like you had handed me your sketchbook with the rough version of that story in it or something like that. And I was trying to capitalize on that with this book and really kind of play up that aspect.
It's funny you say that. First of all, I was going to say, yeah, the intimacy I think is heightened. But last night I was showing your book to a friend of mine I went out to dinner with, and I was telling him about this today. And he said, why did he use the graph paper? And I said, well, I haven't asked him about that, but I assume that he wants it to be like the presentation. Maybe he's not familiar with like Moleskines,
right?
Not a writer, but that he wants it to be like a sketchbook. That's the intent of having it on this paper.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've had the experience many times where I've been hanging out with another cartoonist and they'll be actually working in their sketchbook, and you kind of look over their shoulder or something like that, and you almost are more enticed and sort of tantalized by whatever that is than what their great graphic novel that they're going to publish or they've put out in the past. And so, yeah, that was just the idea, was to sort of make it seem like I was allowing everybody to have that access that is sort of so tantalizing.
There are some great artist sketchbooks that have been published. I always think of Gary Panter's.
Yeah.
And how you could, there are just worlds in every page. It's mesmerizing to look through.
Yeah.
Leslie, were you going to say something? Did I cut you off?
Oh, I was just going to ask a really nerdy question. But if you had printed it, let's say on white paper, this book, what do you think the effect would have been in terms of?
Well, we almost had to, because this book was just going to press in, I think, March or maybe even April, as the lockdown was sort of happening, and the original printer that we were going to use actually was in China, and was one of the first places that got shut down. And so we actually had some discussions about, like, well, what if we just print it somewhere else, and it's going to be more expensive, so we can't make it look like a sketchbook. So what if it's just like a regular book without the rounded corners? And I started thinking, well, then maybe it wouldn't make sense to have the graph paper inside. And so we explored that whole possibility of just printing it on white paper in a regular book cover. And I unfortunately stuck to my guns and forced Drawn and Quarterly to go through this very difficult process of finding a way to do it the way that we originally discussed. And so I will always be grateful to them, and especially to Tracy at Drawn and Quarterly for making it happen in the most difficult circumstances.
Leslie, I know you wanted to get nerdy at some point and talk about panel structure. Is there something that you'd like to ask Adrian about his panels?
Well, I was just kind of, this is all like the 6-panel grid is the whole book pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering about that choice, because that's how I work also, even though I don't have like panels per se,
right.
But I have 6 images per page, and I think it's a really great way to keep a good flow going. And I was wondering how you found it.
Well, I admire your approach, because, like, I of course have to always look at people's books first as a reader and then as a fellow artist, and I kind of analyze it a little bit. And I was impressed to find that there really was a real structure and sort of a pattern to your pages, which I think organizes it and keeps it easy to read. But without the panels and without the square edges, it also makes it feel a lot looser and more, I don't know, I have to think about it more, but it feels more like the way we think about things. I don't know, like it feels more, it gives a greater feeling of being inside your mind and seeing the world, I think, than if it was in a rigid grid the way I did it. But my choice has always been to do whatever it takes to make the work readable. And I know that there's a whole world of storytelling and there's just a whole realm of the art form of comics that involves panel design and page layout. And some of our friends have explored that to groundbreaking lengths, where it sort of changes the way we understand comics. For one, I don't have the talent or the ingenuity to work in that regard. And I think if you don't have that talent or ingenuity, you can run the risk of creating a distraction or a stumbling block for the readers in terms of just taking in the story. So I've always kind of erred on the side of simplicity in my layouts, and with this one, especially since I was kind of making it up as I went, or just going page by page, it was really easier for me to start off by saying each page is just going to be this grid, and then I could sort of almost mathematically figure out to make sure I had enough panels to end on, or something like that, rather than just thinking, how am I going to cram this all in with different layouts per page, and what does each layout mean, and all that. It was just, especially for this story, I think the content and the simplicity of reading it was the most important factor for me.
Yeah, and it does conjure up strips.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I think it's really important as a comics lover. And then there's some aspects of this. This is about also your fandom. It's like that brought you to comics is your love of comics, and so that's really apparent even in that choice to me, and how you're setting up the pages, kind of being like a love letter to the form itself.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a very different book had I not been exposed to things like Peanuts when I was a little kid. I mean, that's been sort of like a lifelong inspiration to me. And it was something that I went back to a lot when I was working on this book, in terms of trying to communicate the story as clearly as possible, and to sort of tell a light and funny story that had like a depth of sadness or frustration or something like that right beneath the surface.
Mm-hmm.
Are there books that you two referred to? And you just mentioned Peanuts, Adrian, but are there memoirs, comics memoirs that were helpful or influential?
Oh, for me? Or how about you, Leslie? Why don't you go first while I think about it?
Yeah, you think about it. Peanuts is a great place to start. Actually, I think about Peanuts a lot in how I draw, actually, because even though when I'm setting up a page, the first thing I do is I find the character, and then I develop the scenes around the character. That's just how I draw. So I can figure out the scale. And I'm using a lot of flat lines like Schultz did in the background. And having my character almost be kind of like a shorthand. So it's like, boom, 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 you're reading fast. And, but the head behind, when I draw it, is a circle, kind of like Charlie Brown's head. And so I set it up based on this kind of circle moving around the page. And that, to me, is how I read Peanuts, as I see the circles first.
Yeah.
So that is, and that kind of lightness and heaviness at the same time. Like, I always want to, reward my reader for looking at it by giving them something that's, hopefully beautiful or funny at the same time as being emotionally significant. So yeah, Peanuts, obviously was huge for me. And then moving forward, when I was a teenager, I think I remember reading Debbie Dreschler's comics. She was a big influence on me in terms of kind of blending autobio and, because I've done a lot of work that's kind of blending autobio and fiction also. So, but her kind of, the sweetness of her characters going through these kind of horrific ordeals made like a very big impact on me. And I thought, this is a great way to explore some difficult subject matter and make it, also a joyful experience just to look at and read. Yeah.
The first professional cartoonists that I ever met were Carol Tyler and Justin Green. When I was a teenager in Sacramento, they actually lived a block away from me. I have kind of a weird magical ability to always end up living very close to great cartoonists, but a mutual acquaintance put us in touch. And so I think I was like 14 or 15, and they invited me over to their house, and I went over there and just hung out for a little bit. And I was familiar with some of their work, but after meeting them, it encouraged me to investigate further. And so I think that whole experience of meeting them, of going to their house, and then of reading very carefully all their work had a huge impact on me. And I'm sure in some level it was on my mind, especially with this book.
I'm gonna throw up a couple last images. My last sort of question. I noticed this wonderful sort of confluence between the two books. It's what Adrian calls obsessive, and Leslie you call focused, and it's in a monologue at the end of toward the end of Adrian's book that hilariously turns out to be a soliloquy. You write, for most of my life, I felt like anything other than working on comics was a distraction. I remember trying to get Nora and May to fall asleep when they were babies and losing my mind because I wanted to be working. And Leslie, in this page here, you show us that you don't have a couch because, as you write, you want all of your energy to be focused on your art making area. And I think that it's true that sort of certainly in any creative endeavor, there's a room of your own, a space of your own to kind of just pack everything. But there's also this sense of guilt that I know goes along certainly with being a parent and trying to create things. But I sort of thought that was interesting, and it dovetails with something that comes again at the end of your book, Adrian, where you write, the only reason I got anywhere in the comics business is just that I was so obsessively, single-mindedly focused for so long. Yeah. It doesn't have to do with talent, training, ability. If I practiced and thought about anything that much, I'd be halfway decent at it by now. I imagine this is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but
no.
It's true. You feel that way.
Yeah, I definitely do. But go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I mean it. I'm just curious about that idea, and Leslie, whether here's this drawing of your workspace. There's definitely sort of obsession there, and I don't want to say that in a judgmental sort of way. And I'm curious, Adrian, why you would feel that there's no talent there?
Oh, me?
And that obsession, that obsession is like the key element.
It's just something that I've believed for a long time, because largely because I didn't have any training. I didn't have any training in art or in comics or in writing. I don't think that I had any particular like natural gift as an artist as a kid. Like all kids, I like to draw, but it wasn't like, this kid's a prodigy or anything like that. And I think that it really, I don't know. I just felt like the amount of time and thought that I put into it definitely played a much bigger role in where I ended up than anything else. And especially now, spending so much time around not just my kids but other kids, and you see that like a 5-year-old, like they're really good at playing music or they're really good at drawing, and then other interests come and take over, and then it just sort of goes by the wayside or something. But I always feel like if any one of those things had locked in and become as much of an obsession as making comics was for me, that would lead to a a successful career or something. There's no way to test it really, but that's just how it seems to me.
Leslie, do you think obsession is an important part of it?
I, for a long time, didn't like the word talent, although I use it because it's just easy. I always thought it's, I said it's having a bit of taste and then hard work, figuring out what you don't want it to look like is just as important as figuring out what you do want it to look like or say. So I always felt like I, for example, I don't consider myself a very good drawer. But I developed a style around kind of like the skills that I was lacking, basically, and that just came from hard work. So I don't know. I think Adrian put it perfectly.
I think you're right about taste too, because especially the comics industry has a long history of like extremely talented drawers who have no taste, and they create like the most beautiful rendered drawings of barbarians or something like that. That just it doesn't register. You know, it's of no interest to me. And also, I was just racking my brain just to see if I could disprove myself. But like, I can't really think of a single cartoonist who had so much talent that they could just be careless and thoughtless and put no work in and still come out with something great. Like, I can't think of anyone like that. But I can think of plenty of people who I think, like us, work really hard and have focused on their work for a long time and think about it all the time, and maybe are not, you know, the best drawers, but they come out with great work because of that.
That's all the time we have.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Drawn in Quarterly, and to the organizers and staff of the Brooklyn Book Festival. And a big thank you to everyone tuning in tonight. A reminder that you can head over to the D&Q booth to purchase these books and many others. And please consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is celebrating its 15th year of presenting free literary programming.